Welcome. Hi there. My name is Kyle. This is Auditing with Autism. Thanks for coming to my channel. I talk about autism related subjects. I play the guitar. I like to play music sometimes. And I talk about philosophy a lot of the times and world events. I graduated from college with a philosophy degree and a literature degree. And so I enjoy discussing philosophy. Today, I want to highlight a philosopher by the name of Ludwig Wittgenstein, who was famous about 100 years ago. He was a protege of one of the most famous philosophers of the 20th century, Bertrand Russell. Bertrand Russell, I think he won a Nobel Prize, and many people wanted to be his protege, but he chose Wittgenstein, who was not known for having published anything. But Wittgenstein is notable because he comes from an extremely wealthy old world money family that he renounced, as a part of his musings of philosophy. He before he even really got in deep with Bertrand Russell, he understood logically and philosophically that he needed to separate himself from the security that the family and the money was going to give him, because he knows the truth of life is to have experiences and to not necessarily be in comfort the whole time. So that impressed Bertrand Russell, I think, enough to accept him as a protege. Another thing that impressed Bertrand Russell about Wittgenstein was that Wittgenstein was involved in World War I. And during that war, Wittgenstein was caught on the battlefield alone, and for 3 days was being bombarded by the enemy, the other side. And for those 3 days, he thought he was going to die for 72 hours. Every second he thought was the next second is when I'm going to die. So for 3 days, he went through basically feeling like he was already dead. He had like a near death experience while being alive on the battlefield. It was an epiphany that changed his character, it changed his personality, his outlook on life. And so that change in character was something that Bertrand Russell picked up on. So Ludwig Wittgenstein, he is a fascinating man, interesting person. Not many people know about him, but in the philosophy world, lots of us do. So I thought I'd share a little bit about Ludwig Wittgenstein for us today. And the concept I'm really trying to point out is this idea that God, the the prime mover, the source, is necessarily meant to be thought logically. It's not a feeling. It's not an opinion. Wittgenstein has such a mechanical mind. He's like a machine. And he was able to use his great brain to describe using language how it is and why it is that we should think about God logically, not just as an opinion. So here it is. First, I want to talk about a little bit about language and its rules so that we can, have our foundation for this language that we're going to use to describe why we should think of God logically and not as an opinion. So the first quote of Wittgenstein goes like this, quote, "A language presupposes rules. Moreover, respect for rules presupposes that assent or dissent from the rules be public. For nothing can guarantee the proper use of a private rule." I mean, it makes sense. Sounds a little complicated, but it certainly makes sense. You can't have, one person saying that's a tree and the next person calls that same thing a whale. We have to be on the same page with our rules concerning words, which reminds me, I put in the community page that I have last week about, I took a screenshot from a book that John F. Kennedy wrote. talking specifically about the importance of being on the same page concerning our definitions for words in our language, so that we can be clear with each other and not obfuscate and try to use the technique of rhetorical language, a rhetorician. Uh, it's a technique that the Greeks it's been around for thousands of years. It's a technique of rhetorical language where we use language against somebody, and I'm learning a lot about that these days. But one last thing I want to say about the language and it being public. There's not many situations where people will have a private language, but I wanted to share that. My grandma created a private language for her grandkids and us to use. And I discovered that this language wasn't as private as I thought it was, because I saw it on TV as I grew up. But she shared with us the op language. Have you guys heard about the op language? Where you put the letter OP, the letters OP in front of every vowel that you hear. So if I wanted to say, for example, how are you? I'm doing fine. In op language, I would say, hapau apar yapu, apayapin dapu aping fapain. And that's a language that we cannot use in public because nobody knows our rules for that. Not many people know the rules for our op language, right? So that's all he's saying there. And it's clear. We need to be on the same page with our definitions and our terms, and how we use these words. Fine. Now, real quick, I'm going to talk about a book that somebody else wrote to get us back into Wittgenstein. A man by the name of Spengler wrote a book called The Decline of the West. I believe he put this book out about 100 years ago, maybe a little bit less than that. But he says that in The Decline of the West, his book distinguishes between the principle of form versus the principle of law. And with the principle of form goes history, poetry, and life. And with the principle of law goes physics, mathematics, and death. And so it sounds sort of confusing, but I'm going to walk us through a little bit. Check this out. And the basis of this distinction, he says, is a general methodological principle. The means whereby to identify dead forms is mathematical law. The means whereby to understand living forms is analogy. Analogy. Now think about it. Analogy, something that's analogous to something else, is going to be like a simile, like a metaphor. It's not going to be actually the thing. It's going to be an example of that idea. It's an idea. When he says the principle of form is analogous to understanding life and history and poetry, that's exactly what poetry is. That's when humans are experiencing their life, they create their own history and they create their experiences described, and we call that poetry. So I had trouble with this because I'm a big science guy and I love physics and I love mathematics. And he's calling my favorite topics, physics, math, some of my favorite topics, he's calling it death. So check it out. He says that it's death because it's the other side. It's the side of God. On the side of life, on our side, where we are alive in this world, we have history. We have poetry to describe our history and to describe our life and to describe the beautiful trees and the beautiful weather and the beautiful person. We create wonderful metaphors and similes and analogies, to describe these things. Now, when we talk about the other principle, the principle of law, that's going to include God and its universe that is contingent for the very life that we have these forms to have history and poetry, right? So follow me on this. We necessarily need the law, the principle of law, which will then allow us to have the principle of forms. So we need the principle of death to have the principle of life. Let me double check this. Yeah. Sorry about that. But I know this may sound complicated, but I just want to say it one more time. When we talk about the principle of law, he says that includes physics and mathematics. Physics equals everything that's in the universe. And mathematics is the language that humans have created to describe exactly how physics works. Math describing physics, physics equals the universe equals God, or the source, or the prime mover, or if you like, the contingency with which life comes from. If you don't believe in that, well, then you're a nihilist, and this is going to be an interesting thing to hear for you, maybe. So, again, just last time, the principle of form, life, poetry, history, the principle of law equals the other side, death, math, and physics, the universe. So I went to a lot of trouble to describe that so that I could continue with what I'm about to describe and how Wittgenstein is going to show us why it is logical to believe in God. Wittgenstein says, quote, an inner process stands in need of an outward criteria. So if we're going to have an inner process, we first need to use all of our feelings, all of the senses that we have to hear, see, smell, taste, touch what is outside of ourselves. And then he says we need an inner process to understand this outside of ourselves information. And that inner process is the principle of form. Again, the poetry, the history it creates, and life. And so it's a beautiful thing because he's really seeing how life blends with the other side constantly. I mean, necessarily. And without a doubt, we don't experience our daily lives without the other side. He calls it death. We don't experience our life daily without death daily also being there, right there. So I know that sounds kind of weird, but follow me. Here we go. So basically, he says, quote, but this is precisely what we are doing here. We philosophers are collating one form of language with its environment or transforming it in imagination so as to gain a view of the whole of space in which the structure of our language has its being. I think that is a, sorry. I think that's a perfect summation or definition of philosophy. It excites me every time I read that because it's what I'm trying to do here even right now. It's what I see people who I watch daily on YouTube doing daily. They're collating a form of language with its environment or even transforming it in our imagination so as to gain a view of the whole of space in which the structure of our language has its being. People who are into playing these, I was going to call them language games. And again, I don't mean game in a bad way. I mean, these are, these language laws, the rules, the structures, probably is the best word. These people who understand language structures and know how to use them in positive, beneficial ways, and then share that with other people. They're like philosophers, they're like scientists, they're like heroes, they're like angels. I mean, they're people that are necessary for all of us to read and hear about. And we're doing it with each other constantly. We'll pick a grand mind like Einstein or Bertrand Russell or Wittgenstein or philosophers like this, and we all know about them because they affected all of us. But we're all of us affecting everybody every day, which is why I would love to see the idea in Socrates' book, The Republic, become a natural law for all of us, where the entire group is educated to such a level that any one person could be selected at random and become the philosopher king, which is, excuse me, I got it today. The philosopher king is basically, whoa, not the leader exactly, but the person who will be administrating for the rest of everybody else. Huh. The light looks better with the door shut a little bit. So the wind just blew my door shut. Okay, so Wittgenstein basically is saying that what philosophers are doing is trying to establish a language that everybody understands the games of these languages. Man, sorry about the throat clearing. I'm trying so hard not to do it. Okay, so not only Wittgenstein is not only saying that we need to understand our definitions and the rules of these language games to clearly explain our experiences and our ideas, but he says also that when you are sharing an idea, this goes back to the last video I made with Hume. It's similar to the idea of conception and belief. Wittgenstein says, quote, acquiring a concept is a process of becoming able to do something, unquote. So when you acquire a concept and you put your belief into it, and then you have a belief. When you acquire a concept, let's say the concept is driving a car, right? Everybody pretty much learns how to do that at some point in their life. This concept of driving a car. It was first a concept before we knew how to drive the car. We knew about car driving. Maybe we looked forward to doing it. It was a concept. And then we didn't have a belief in our ability to do the driving. We just had a concept of it. But the belief doesn't happen until we have enough love and confidence in ourselves to go try to do it. And if you try to do something without love and confidence in yourself, it's going to be a little different than when you're doing it with a positive action. But I'm going to suggest that when a person gets up out of their chair and goes to the car to learn how to drive the car, that action is a loving action right there. That is a positive feeling. If they chose to do that themselves because they want to learn how to drive, even if the experience of learning is terrible, they are using their feeling to choose to want that that concept realized for them. And so I thought it was an interesting idea to write down. Acquiring a concept is a process of becoming able to do something, which means that when we're learning how to do anything, any concept is going to be a process of being able to do something, even if it's just mental exercises, is also being able to do something, even if you don't get up out of the chair. So acquiring a concept uses our ability to choose. And using our ability to choose, again, we necessarily have to use all five senses, most of them, our feelings, the feelers that we have on our body and in our mind, to have an opinion about it. You don't, this is kind of a point of contention, because I know some people think, you're talking too much about feelings and not enough about logic, which is one of the reasons I'm bringing up this idea of logic, the principle of form versus the principle of law. The principle of law is, I'm going to show, is going to be based on logic. And the principle of form is based on love, because that equals life. The principle of form equals life, life equals love. The principle of law equals death, and death equals God. And that's where I'm going to take us. And the principle of law is logical. That's the thesis for this whole video today. So I'm still getting there. If you don't mind bearing with me, these quotes are really interesting, but I just wanted to mention that, when you have a judge in a courtroom, for example, they're not supposed to use their opinions and feelings about their, how they feel about the case in front of them. They're supposed to stay totally logical, right? Using just the law. I bring that up because it's really obvious that there's no judge in the world that adjudicates a case without using their feeling. To have an opinion, you necessarily have to have feelings involved. And, simply because if you start with using your senses, your five senses, which are your feelers that you put out into the world, just to even be able to read the pages that the judge has to read the pages to receive the information. And now that information is in her head, and she has to now, conceive an opinion. And the judge is supposed to make an opinion on the case, not based on feeling, but obviously they do. And the way I can prove that is that we know statistically and factually that if you are unfortunate enough to have a case in front of a judge right before lunch, you have a 75% chance that the judge is going to be in a bad mood and not rule in your favor. But if you're lucky enough to have a case after lunch, you'll have that 75% chance that the judge will feel good and give you a better opinion. And so this is a proven fact that anybody can look up, and it proves that there's no way, even if it's your job, to have a non-feeling opinion. And it's also the reason that, the book, The Decline of the West, is talking about these two forms, the form of the principle of form and the principle of law. The principle of law is great, even though it's described as death and mathematics, which a lot of people think is like death, and physics, which a lot of people don't like either. But, physics and math and death seem very bad, right? But actually, it's very, very good. It's what sustains us. Listen to this. He says that everything descriptive of a language game is part of logic. Quote, the line of thought here is strikingly reminiscent of the Tractatus as, quote, everything descriptive of a language game is part of logic, unquote. And then I wrote, the line of thought here is strikingly reminiscent of his book, the Tractatus, as he later acknowledges. The idea is that if the contrary to a proposition makes sense, this is going to get a little philosophically complicated, but I'll explain it. But listen to this. The idea here is that if the contrary to a proposition makes sense, then the proposition can be regarded as an empirical hypothesis. its truth or falsity being dependent on the way things stand in the world. But, for example, like science. But if the contrary of a proposition does not make sense, then the proposition is not descriptive of the world, but of our conceptual framework. It is then a part of logic. So God is a part of logic because God is that which is contingent for sustaining the universe. So, for example, if physical objects exist, so physical objects exist is not an empirical proposition, for its contrary is not false, but incomprehensible. The idea that God doesn't exist is incomprehensible. It is therefore contrary. So it's therefore, if the contrary of a proposition does not make sense, and that does not make sense, anything that is contingent for life is going to be in the second part, is going to be not make sense if it's the contrary of a proposition. Oh boy, I'm making a little bit of a mistake here. I'm not speaking clearly, but I knew I should have separated these two paragraphs and described each one. I'm going to do that now. In the first paragraph, I said, if the contrary to a proposition makes sense, then the proposition can be regarded as an empirical hypothesis, its truth or falsity being dependent on the way things stand in the world. So let's say I say to you, the proposition is there's a tree standing over there. And you say, no, there is no tree. And so we can go over there and just touch the tree, smell the tree, cut the tree, taste the tree, and then we can show that that it's there. It's true that there is a tree there. The contrary to a proposition makes sense. But if the contrary of a proposition does not make sense, then the proposition does not describe the world, but our conceptual framework. My God, am I going to have to cut this out maybe? I'm 27 minutes in. That's too bad. I'm going to just have to tear my way through this. Obviously, I don't understand it as much as I thought I did to help you understand it. I do get it, but basically, he's saying that if you have a proposition like the universe exists, and the opposite of that doesn't make sense, then it's not descriptive of our framework of the world. So the opposite of the universe exists would be that the universe doesn't exist. And that's too ridiculous to, it doesn't make any sense. Of course, it has to exist. And so because it exists, it is not descriptive of the world. What is descriptive of the world, according to Wittgenstein, is something that can have an empirical hypothesis by showing that its truth or falsity is dependent on the way things stand in the world. And so, I can tell, let me just say this quote. So, yeah, boy, I had trouble with that one. Here, let me see if I can clean it up with this quote. Quote, Wittgenstein says, I am sitting with a philosopher in the garden. He says again and again, I know that that's a tree, pointing to a tree that is near us. Someone else arrives and hears this, and I tell them, this fellow isn't insane. We're only doing philosophy. So pardon me if I sound a little crazy, but if I can say there is a tree over there, and I can imagine also that tree not being there, then that is a description of the world. I can empirically build on that. If I can say, that the room is dark, and I can also say the opposite, that the room is lit, then that's then that's a truth. That's a valid proposition for describing the way things are in the world. If you can describe something in its opposite, like like I just did, like the absence of sound versus sound. These are two complete opposites, right? I can imagine easily the absence of sound. I can also imagine sound. And so these are descriptives in the world. But if I say that I can imagine the universe, but I cannot imagine life without the universe or being without the universe, then that is not a descriptive, that is not something that we can say is empirically valid, that we can build up like using science. It's a framework for our ability to, well, how does he say it? It's a framework for our concept. And therefore, it is a part of logic. It has to be. If if the opposite is not available, then it is absolutely logical that it exists. So if, boy, it took a long time to get here, but and I probably lost a lot of you. I'm sorry about that. But basically he's saying it's logical to believe in God, because if you don't believe in God, then how do you exist? If you believe in God, then you believe that God created the universe. And if you don't think that there's anything, if you can't imagine life without the universe, then you can't imagine life without God. So God would therefore be extremely logical. Everything else is sort of in flux. A tree could be there, tomorrow it may not. A room is dark and then it's lit. There was no sound and now there's sound. These are when you can, so you see what I'm saying? When you can see that there's an opposite to proposition, then it's a descriptive proposition to our reality, in our lived reality in the universe. But if you can find those rare propositions where you cannot see or show the opposite, or even the idea of not having the opposite is unrealistic, not valid, then you've come across something that's logical. And these things are called laws, or math, or physics. So the law of God is math and physics. uh, you know, that's not really true exactly, but it is sort of, in a way. It's a part of the law of God. But the law of God is logical. And so anybody who says that it's not logical to believe in God, they certainly haven't been reading the philosophy of Wittgenstein or understanding how things are so changeable in our lived world, especially when you study quantum mechanics. You understand how really fluid and in flux everything constantly is. I'm using the idea of a tree being here today and then not here tomorrow as an example of how he's describing the proposition that can be regarded as empirical, because its truth or falsity is dependent on the way things are in the world. Oh, if the contrary to the proposition makes sense, then it can be regarded as, a description of our world. The contrary to the proposition of there is a tree standing there is that there is no tree standing there. And that's easy to believe. Okay, so I think I made our way through that enough. You know, basically, the idea, again, just to envelope this whole thought, is that in the book The Decline of the West by the author Spangler, he said that the principle of form, you know, deals with history, poetry, and life, and that the principle of law deals with physics, mathematics, and death, and that the principle of law deals with deals with that which our lives are contingent. Without physics and the math that we use to describe the very physics that make up the universe, we wouldn't have our lives. And so it's logical. That's the only logical thing that we can really truly say that is logical, is the law of God. And the principle of form is so much fun because that's where our history and life and poetry is. That's where we get to live the very expression of the law of God. And so it's kind of fun to think about. I have a lot of fun thinking about it all the time, thinking about how we are expressions of God living life, and we have these language games and these, other games, and some games are bad. The language game of rhetoric, very, very bad. I think the last video I made, I was talking about Hume, and I got into talking about uh, an author of a book not being your friend. Well, I'd forgotten about, the history of the science of rhetorical language. Using the technique of rhetoric has been around for 2,500 years or longer, probably. It's a technique that the Greeks, the ancient Greeks, they had used it a lot to try to convince other people what, their concepts. And they would use it as a science, rhetoric, and it wasn't based on trying to help anybody out. They were trying to control and be powerful over another person by convincing them. And so, it's not the greatest of techniques because it deals more with ego than it does with love or things like that. But it's also part of the human condition. It's part of who we are. We use these language games to do this with each other. Lawyers use rhetoric a lot. They know that it's what they're saying isn't exactly truthful concerning the spirit of the law or situation. They're using rhetoric to technically use language to get their client out of trouble. And that's, valid up to a point, but, you know what I mean. You don't want to see anybody get hurt just because one person was able to convince another person of some bull BS, rhetoric. One of the founding fathers of the Catholic Church is St. Augustine. St. Augustine. Well, before he became patristic, a father of the Catholic Church, one of the fathers, he was a famous rhetorician. He was known for using rhetoric to convince people of things. He was a master at it, and he was able to hurt people with it. Well, when he wrote his book, The Confessions, his Confessions, he talked about feeling bad about using that technique of rhetoric to hurt people. And he, changed his spirit. He changed who he was. He became so good that he became a father of the Catholic Church. But I have to say, in my opinion, I've never had a fond feeling for St. Augustine because of that fact, because he was a bullshitter in his early years, and he wasn't, it's a part of, I think it's kind of like a part of who he is. And so when I read his work, I am not picking up a sincere feeling. So I guess I did understand this idea of, bad authors, but not in a novel. In a novel, I didn't think it would ever be used in a novel where you're telling a story. You want people to come along with your story. So anyway, I'm going to leave us with this last quote here. If you've made it this far, I hope you Hope you have, and I hope you can listen to this because it's a lot of fun. He said he's basically saying a joke to his friend here. He says, "Quote, well, I say when his house host Wittgenstein was staying at his friend Morgan's house. When his house host Morgan asked Wittgenstein whether he believed in God, he replied, 'Yes, I do. But the difference between what you believe and what I believe may be infinite.'" And that's his little joke there, if you can kind of get the joke, the idea of something being infinite. And um, the difference between how I would believe in God and you might believe in God being infinite is God itself. So I think that's really a great little fun joke. And even though I said that was the last thing, I'm going to put one more thing out there because this is really what a lot of people are doing today. I see people on YouTube every day doing this. Quote, this is Ludwig Wittgenstein himself writing these words. Quote, an honest religious thinker is like a tightrope walker. He almost looks as though he were walking on nothing but air. His support is the slenderest imaginable, and yet it really is possible to walk on it. Unquote. That's an honest religious thinker. Is just like that tightrope walker, you know. So be careful how you walk, everybody, especially you. Don't want to lose you. I love you guys. Thanks for watching this video. If you get anything out of this, think about subscribing, or hitting the like button. I'd appreciate it. Helps the algorithm a little bit. Have a great day, you guys. Bye-bye.